What is going on, everybody? Welcome in to the next episode of my off-season deep dive series. Today, we reveal the number 30 team in my power rankings heading into next season in the Carolina Panthers, a team that is coming off a true nightmare season. I honestly was relatively optimistic last year that Frank Reich was going to do a good job, that this offensive line was going to be even like above average, certainly not the worst in the league by a significant margin, and that Bryce Young was going to hit the ground running certainly a lot more than he did last year. So, this is obviously a team that has had a very busy offseason trying to wipe away what happened last year. It felt like they were really kind of fighting into a tsunami all season long, whether it was the coaching or a meddling owner or a quarterback that wasn't quite ready or an offensive line that had never seen a stunt before, apparently, or wide receivers that couldn't get open. They're trying to come up for air this year and forget about what happened last year. And it's going to be a really fun episode to take a look at if that's going to be possible for this team. Before we do get started, I do ask if you have enjoyed this series or if you enjoy this video, if you could please take just a second to hit that like button. It really does help get this video more views. This is all I have time to produce over the course of the summer. Each episode takes about 30 plus hours to make, so if you could take just a second to hit that like button, it's a free and easy thing that really does help the channel. And of course, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of the 29 remaining deep dives that we have leading up to the season. But without further ado, let's dive into my new hometown team, the Carolina Panthers, moving to Charlotte in July. So I'm hoping they are a little better than the 30th team in the NFL this year if I'm going to be watching them live. But let's go ahead and get started, as always, by taking a look at this team's offseason. And honestly, I'm really impressed by the offseason that this team had. There was a ton of questions about the front office. Of course, with David Tepper and all of his meddlings last year, there was questions if a David Tepper run front office could have a good offseason. And, they promoted internally as well in Dan Morgan. And it was like, man, we looked at what the Panthers did. It was like, this was the worst run front office since the John Gruden Raiders, basically. Why are you going to hire from within? And there was a lot of questions on like, are they going to make the right moves this offseason? And honestly, when I was doing my off-season wish list type of content in January and talking about kind of how I would fix the Carolina Panthers, they essentially did everything I at least would have done, whatever that's worth, and that is just pooling everything you possibly can into the offense to just give Bryce Young a legitimate chance to show you what he can be this year. And I again like what they did. They converted a lot of defensive assets into offensive assets, and I think are giving themselves a very real chance to look like an NFL football team this year. So let's go through it. That obviously starts with the coaching staff changes, which an obvious upgrade. I mean, you could ask your newborn son or your grandma to coach the 2023 Carolina Panthers, and it would be better than what Frank Reich tried to organize last year. And I got to hold my hand up and be like, dude, I was so wrong about my stance on Frank Reich heading into last year. I thought he was going to be good. I had the Panthers ranked like 20th last year, maybe 21st. I felt like he kind of got thrown under the bus with a disastrous, chaotic situation in Indianapolis, and Reich wasn't really at fault. He was kind of the fall guy. I was wrong. I mean, he goes to Carolina, gets fired, rightfully so, 2/3 of the way through his first season. And what's really crazy about this is I know he's not an offensive line guy, and I know correlation doesn't always imply causation, but when you look at Indianapolis and their offensive line in 2022 with Matt Ryan, we expected it to be a good O-line, and it was a nightmare. They couldn't pick up a blitz. They couldn't identify a stunt. All of it. Like, that was a brutally terrible offensive line in 2022, despite the fact that we thought the personnel was pretty good. Well, Frank Reich leaves, goes to Carolina. Indianapolis' offensive line, boom, all of a sudden, they're blocking the right guys. You look at Carolina, before Frank Reich got here, they looked like a top 10 offensive line at the end of the 2022 season. That was a ringing, consensus piece of optimism for this Panthers team was, okay, Bryce doesn't have the best weapons, but at least he has a good offensive line. No, they were kind of by far the worst offensive line last year, and it was a lot of the same issues that happened with Frank Reich, with blitzes and stunts and just guys, laid off the ball, throwing at air, playing slow. Like, I can't explain it. Frank Reich is a quarterbacks guy, not an offensive line guy. But, I mean, you put 2 and 2 together, and it's like something within Frank Reich's staff is not paying attention to the details in terms of, we got to block dudes up front. Otherwise, the starting point for any offense is going to be horrible. So you rip him out. You rip Thomas Brown out, who had similar issues when he took over with Frank Reich in the last 2 months of the year. And you put in Dave Canales, who I would say had the reverse effect with a Bucs offensive line that had major questions last year and were pretty solid for Baker Mayfield. You saw guys like Luke Gedeke take a massive leap under this scheme, under this play calling. Brad Idzik comes over as well from the Bucs, and how can it not be better on the offensive side of the ball? I mean, it will essentially be impossible to be any worse than what the coaching was in Carolina last year. And that's just as a starting point before I talk about the fact that I like Dave Canales. I think it's a very good hire. If you're trying to save Bryce Young from a nightmare rookie season, who better than the guy that made Geno Smith a relevant quarterback, or at least helped with Shane Waldron in Seattle, and then completely revived Baker Mayfield's career to the point that he got a massive contract extension last year. So I love the hire. We'll talk a lot more about kind of the scheme and what that'll look like there. But coaching, how could it not be upgraded? And even down to the special teams coordinator. Their special teams were bad last year. They're going to go with a new Tracy Smith there. So hoping to get improvements there. And then I also have to mention that for all of the criticism of David Tepper, and I'm not saying a lot of that isn't justified, but they kind of played hardball with their defensive coordinator, Ejiro Evero, who actually was like one of the only pieces of optimism last year, is the job that Evero did with that defense last year. Someone that's highly respected within the league and obviously within this organization. You know, a lot of teams would have just let Evero free and interview elsewhere and get a different opportunity. But teams do have the right to block interviews and block you from leaving. And while it kind of sucked for Evero because, he probably wanted to go to more of a winning organization, maybe go be the Eagles defensive coordinator or whatever, not specifically the Eagles, but something like that. The Panthers blocked him from doing that. And while it kind of sucks for Evero, it was a really necessary move for this Panthers team because he's super talented. He is a defensive coordinator that can lift up a so-so roster just as he did last year. And if they're going to spend time converting defensive assets, things like Brian Burns, into offensive capital, to get that continuity with the coaching staff back on that side of the ball so you don't have to worry as much there, was a brilliant and necessary move by Tepper and all of the, Dan Morgan and the existing leadership structure in Carolina. And hopefully winning cures all wounds and there won't be any bad blood between Evero and the Panthers. But I did want to shout out that as a move that they made that I think was very smart. But the rest of the roster here offensively, I think is the most massively upgraded unit in the NFL. I do. Obviously no change at quarterback, so nothing to say there. But at running back, all they did was bring in the very talented Jonathan Brooks in the second round out of Texas. At tight end, Hayden Hurst, who was a horrible signing for them last year, is already out the door, but they bring in Jatavion Sanders in the fourth round. Just by availability alone, I think should be a slight upgrade there and a potential big upgrade if he can reach his upside as a guy that a lot of people saw as more of a day two type of prospect. But then at wide receiver, massive upgrades here. They do lose DJ Chark, who I'll admit made a couple tough catches when I was watching this team on film that impressed me, but for the most part was an abysmal wide receiver for them as a part of an abysmal wide receiver group. And they bring in Deontay Johnson. I think from a value perspective, one of the best moves that was made this offseason, flipping, Dante Jackson, who's a low-end number 2 corner, for Deontay Johnson, who's a legit, kind of 1B type of wide receiver in my mind. Maybe some off-field stuff, maybe wants a new contract, but in terms of talent and what this team needs, massive upgrade there. They draft Xavier Legette to get some verticality to this offense in the first round, trading up a spot. And then also got to mention David Moore, who played really well on about 250, 300 snaps for the Bucs in this offense last year with Dave Canales coming over. And just as a depth piece, he would have been probably their number 2 wide receiver last year. So that's worth noting for this team specifically. So massive upgrades with the wide receiver. And then the additions with the offensive line, when you account as well for the players that weren't available for them for injuries last year, the offensive line that they're adding to this team, I think is a better O-line than they had to field last year. Like if you put Brady Christensen at left tackle and the Yosh Nijman from the Packers at right tackle, who's been like a decent swing tackle, has started a lot of games, and then you get back Austin Corbett as their center, who they gave a big contract a couple years ago, Damian Lewis, and the big signing Robert Lewis from Miami. That's a better offensive line than they were able to field last year, and they have other guys already on this roster that you like. So massive upgrades. I think probably the most upgraded unit in the league is the Panthers offensive line, and that shouldn't be controversial based on the money they spent and getting a couple good players back from injury, or at least Austin Corbett is a good player. And then they are losing Bradley Bozeman. I don't think they're too worried about it. He wasn't that good last year. So, I mean, just monumental upgrades for this offense. I'm really excited for this side of the ball. But then defensively, I mean, look, it's obviously a tough pill to swallow, trading away Brian Burns, the second best football player on this team. And the edge room is downgraded. We'll get there. But I actually like that move in the context of kind of what they've been able to do this offseason. I agree with kind of taking that chess piece and converting it essentially into offensive help. They get a second-round pick. They spend it on Jonathan Brooks, who's a running back, but a talented running back. But that's not so much what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the money that it opened up. You spend 30-something million on the 2 guards. You acquire Deontay Johnson, who isn't cheap. And then it also opens up cap space to fill in some other holes with a variety of different veteran players here that in the sum, you're hoping can be something close to what Brian Burns gave you last year. And honestly, with what they did, I think they got pretty close to replacing that void. So I actually like the offseason they had on the defensive side of the ball when you put it in the context of like they were focused on offense, right? But honestly, with the exception of the edge room, I think they got better or stayed neutral everywhere else. On the interior defensive line, they're only losing Deshaun Williams and adding a capable, bigger defensive tackle in A'Shawn Robinson. They draft Jaden Cromartie, kind of a developmental piece in the 6th round. And then, of course, on the edge, that is where you're going to see the downgrades. Brian Burns is a legit true impact pass rusher. Replacing him is not going to be easy, but Jadeveon Clowney, even if they can get 80% of what he was last year, that's a very good signing for what they paid him. They also lost Yetur Gross-Matos. I think that's pretty close to a push, bringing in DJ Wanham there. And then Kayvon Chason gets a contract here as well. So it is downgraded. There's no way to kind of get around that. But again, what the Brian Burns trade opened up for the rest of these moves, I think well worth it for the Panthers. And I will also say, like, Burns is a very talented player. He's a low-end number 1. But is he a $30 million pass rusher that was untradeable? I don't think so, if you get what I'm saying there. But anyway, at linebacker, I left this as neutral just because it's to be determined if Shaq Thompson can come off a broken leg at 31 years old and be the guy he's been. But you do get him back, who played 2 games last year, and they bring in Josie Jewell, who was a very nice budget signing, someone that's going to be better here than he would be probably anywhere else because he played his best football under Avero's defense in Denver. But they did lose Frankie Louvu, who's a very talented linebacker. They got, I can't even say adequate play from Kamu Grugier-Hill, but Deion Jones did some fun stuff in coverage, actually. I think Thompson and Josie Jewell could actually be an upgrade if Thompson stays healthy, but I think it's a push in the linebacker room. They also brought in a couple rookies that they don't expect to play this year. Cornerback room, this is going to surprise some people. I actually think this room is better off this year than they were last year, especially when for this exercise I consider when players were injured. And J.C. Horn only played a quarter of their games last year. Now, that is part of his game is he just has a hard time staying healthy, but he's healthy now, and if you can get him for a full year, I think Dane Jackson is pretty much a push with Dante Jackson. Maybe not off of name value, but in terms of consistency, I think Dane Jackson is more consistent, just not quite the athlete. And then CJ Henderson, former first-round pick, but he was horrible. So I do think this is slightly upgraded, getting J.C. Horn back healthy, when I basically see the rest of it as a push. And then with the safety group also neutral, flipping Von Bell for Jordan Fuller, that's pretty much a push in my mind. Both kind of capable safeties, nothing special. And then Jeremy Chin is going to leave. I'm excited for what he's going to do in Washington, but they didn't really use him last year. So another guy that by name looks like a pretty big loss, but really wasn't a factor for their defense at all. And then they bring in Nick Scott from Cincinnati. And then special teams, really not a whole lot of change other than the change in coordinators. So for a team that 3-4 months ago, it was like, oh my God, they have a meddling owner, an incompetent front office. They just hired from within. This team is incapable of making good moves. I look at this offseason and genuinely, I know I was high on this team last year and I was wrong. And I'm really hoping that doesn't happen again this year. But from starting January on, they did all of the stuff that I think makes total sense. And from an outside looking in perspective as well, it seems like David Tepper has cooled off a little bit. Only time will tell. But hopefully, he's just kind of letting the football people do the football stuff. And if that can lead to off seasons like this, that can lead to you winning football games over time. So it's a very good starting point in terms of the offseason for the Panthers. But let's transition to the next segment here, breaking down this coaching staff and what the scheme for this team is going to look like on both sides of the ball. But I mean, there's really not anything bad to say about the Dave Canales hire. This is kind of the new wave of what teams are swinging for. It's kind of like drafting the high upside quarterback in the draft, right? Like, get the young coach that's done some good stuff, that has run modern looking principles, that if he's good, you don't have to be like the Tampa Bay Bucks, where the second you luck into a Dave Canales, he has one good year and he's hired by someone else, right? Like, if this guy can hit, you can be set up for long-term success, and that's a very sound process. Now, in terms of the overall coach and culture ranking that I give for these teams, which acts as that sort of benefit of the doubt slider, how could you not rank the Panthers anywhere other than last or tied for last with Washington, where this team just has not earned benefit of the doubt? This was a nightmare last year, and they have so much work to do in terms of chemistry and identity and figuring out all of the different threads that you need to tie things together with a football team to build a good culture, from front office to coaching to players within individual position units. Like, there's just so much work to be done in that regard. But I think in terms of the pass game scheming that you should get from Dave Canales, it should be pretty good. I've got him ranked kind of close to the middle of the league there. Canales comes essentially from the Shanahan tree, Shane Waldron through Sean McVay down to Dave Canales is kind of his lineage in the NFL. He did spend some time doing some more pro-style stuff with guys like Darrell Bevell and Brian Schottenheimer, but where he's really had that success is under the more sort of play-action, wide zone family of offenses, which is what about 2/3 of the league is running these days. And, we saw certainly a fair share of that in Tampa Bay, and I think that's a really good system for Bryce Young, where you're going to get him on the move. You're going to get him out of the pocket. You're going to create moving pockets as well, which I think can help a shorter quarterback because, things are just more jumbled up. There's more space, and there's going to be more room for him to kind of create and see from the sort of moving pocket that you'll get off of these play action looks. And you should just get better protection in general. Play action helps create better pass protection because, you get defensive linemen basically playing the run instead of getting upfield quickly. So it will help. And, Carolina tried to pivot towards this like mid-season because that's not really Frank Reich's offense. Reich is more of a spread them out pro style type of guy, or at least modern pro style. And then Thomas Brown does come from the sort of wide zone family. They tried to pivot midseason, and it was just a nightmare. No one knew who to block. They couldn't really, pick up the right guys off of play action. That stuff should be so much better with Dave Canales, let alone his ability to kind of scheme guys open and get guys good looks down the field. So if from that department, it should be way better run, and I'm very optimistic for what Dave Canales is going to do. Now, I mentioned there's really not a bad thing to say about Dave Canales. That's not entirely true. He has essentially everything to prove in terms of run game. Not only is he coming into a Panthers team that had, I will continue to use the word nightmarish blocking up front, just guys going unblocked, making plays in the backfield. They had horrible run schemes last year from start to finish. But you look at what the Bucs did last year, and granted, like Rachaad White has some of the worst vision for starting running backs in the NFL, so that didn't help. But they were the worst run game in the league, and I thought really lacked creativity. And there is something to be said about someone that understands the X's and O's and the numbers and the scheming of the run game, and I don't know that they have that here, especially with Brad Idzik coming over from Tampa Bay. So that is where it's like they have everything to prove in that regard, in terms of the existing pieces in the run game, plus Dave Canales. So if you've got a a negative thing to say, it's like they got to figure out the run game. But overall, it's a hire I'm optimistic about. They just have work to do. But then you look at the defensive side of the ball, and I mentioned this earlier, but them kind of blocking Evero from getting interviews elsewhere and going somewhere else, while it was potentially a bit of a dick move to keep him here after what transpired last year, it was the right move for the Panthers organization. He is one of the best assets that this team has. He really is. And, I mean, quietly had one of the more impressive coaching efforts last year for a injured, depleted defense that was on the field constantly. They had one of the better pass defenses in the entire league, and it's impressive, man. I think Evero wanted to go elsewhere because he knows, like, not necessarily that he doesn't want to be in Carolina, but that he knows if he could coach up a top 10 defense for a playoff caliber team, he might be the next defensive coach in line to be a head coach in the league. And I don't think he's that far off of it. So I get why he wanted to leave. But that's not to say that still can't happen for him in Carolina. Again, I thought he did a phenomenal job last year. In terms of run defense, I don't have a ton to really say for Evero. I think he's fine. The run defense was really bad last year, but I think it was much more about the injuries at linebacker and how bad their interior defensive line was outside of Derek Brown. So I don't really pin that on Evero. But in terms of what he does in the pass defense, it's really impressive. And a lot of people say he's a Fangio scheme. Yes and no. He spent a lot of time under Fangio, going back to the early 2010s, and under Brandon Staley, most recently with the Rams. And you certainly see those influences in this defense. They do like to start in split safety, two high structures, do some of those Fangio principles in terms of up and down rotation, not really letting the quarterback know pre-snap what coverage he's going to get. You see some of those principles, but in terms of the coverages he calls and what this defense is, it's not strictly, he's not like Joe Barry and Ed Donatel and these Fangio disciples that were like, oh, we're going to come in and just run quarters all day, and you're going to have to nickel and dime us all day, and we can't stop the run. That's not this defense. Evero, I think, has been the closest to Vic Fangio in terms of taking those principles that work in a split safety, pattern matching zone defense that has been known as the Fangio scheme. But, adjusting to your opponent and what they're trying to do to you, game plan specific things, mix up your coverages. In fact, the Panthers didn't run a lot of cover 4 at all last year. They led the league in cover 3, if you include cover 3 seam, or, fire blitzes out of cover 3. And then they ran a lot of cover 6, which has quarters elements, but they only ran quarters 6% of the time, which is actually, I'm just trying to eyeball it here, that is 30th in quarters coverage. This is more of a hybridized Fangio type of defense. And with that heavy usage of cover 3, that's where you look at, Raheem Morris runs a lot of cover 3. Wade Phillips, especially with those Rams defenses from 17 to 19. Even Dom Capers, the 1 year in Green Bay there, was kind of a cover 3 fire zone style defense. So he kind of has a variety of tricks in his bag. And yes, he'll start in that 2-high structure a lot. But doesn't lean on, okay, we're playing off like bend don't break defense all day. Like, there are aggressive tendencies. They'll get in your face. They'll run man to man when they need to. He's just a very good defensive coordinator in general. So very well schemed, very well coached. I know I've said it like 4 times at this point, but keeping Avero around, big deal for this Panthers defense. But it is now time to transition to break down this roster where we're going to rank each position group, how they stack up against the rest of the league. But before we do that and start talking about these players in depth, I do want to thank the sponsor for today's video, Underdog Fantasy. Look, if you are watching this video and all the videos in this series, you are an NFL sicko. Most people out there playing these fantasy contests haven't done the research you're doing right now by watching this video. That means you've got an edge on your competition if you want to participate in Underdog Fantasy's best ball competitions, where you can pull out your phone, draft your teams right now. So if these rookies are going to ball out this season, or you got sleepers that you already liked and you're hearing me talk about them in the same light and you want to target those guys, you can get them right now before they get to training camp and start to pop off. And then these lineups are locked and loaded. You don't have to set them every week. You're in these contests with massive payouts. Best ball is super fun, and that's not the only way to play on Underdog Fantasy. Their pick'em contests are the best. As a diehard NFL fan that's trying to get through the dog days of sports over the summer, Underdog pick'em slips help you keep you interested in MLB games, NBA playoffs, you name it. You can go play right now. But then, of course, when the NFL is back in full swing, you can take your knowledge of the game there, where with pick'em, you string together your lineup of 2 to 3 players, player stats. You can cross, NBA with NFL, with MLB, you name it, and massive payout opportunities if your picks hit. Love me some pick'em, love me some best ball, love me some Underdog Fantasy, and I think you guys will too. If you sign up using promo code TFG right now, you can get up to a $250 match on your first deposit, and you'll support my channel and this deep dive series in the process. So thank you to Underdog for sponsoring the video, and let's get into these players on this roster, starting with the passing game breakdown, where it is time to talk about Bryce Young. And for me with Bryce, the way I look at his rookie season is the good, the bad, and the ugly. And, the good being the good things he did that did exist on film, the bad being the stuff that was in his control, that he was bad at, that he needs to get better at. And then the ugly, in terms of the ugliness of the Carolina Panthers, that he had no control over and would have set any quarterback up to fail in the existing structure of the Panthers offense last year. And it's, there's aspects of all these things. So let's start with the good on Bryce Young. I'm not going to oversell it. There just wasn't a ton of good. And I would say 3/4 of that was just there wasn't opportunity for good. There weren't wide receivers open. There wasn't time for him to throw. So you have to really squint to find those plays where he had receivers open. He had protection in front of him. And a lot of times when he got that, he executed on it, right? You did see a quarterback that progresses defenses, gets 1 to 2 to 3, and can play within the timing of the offense. You see a quarterback as well that throws with anticipation, and despite the size criticisms, he's a quarterback that will throw with anticipation over the middle of the field. That was one thing I really liked about Bryce Young, is he does target the middle of the field. He's not like some of his other undersized counterparts in the NFL, guys like Russell Wilson and Kyler Murray, that haven't really targeted that part of the field. You see those throws with Bryce Young where he'll throw a dig or a crosser with anticipation into the middle of his own defense. And in terms of the overall processing and decision making, This wasn't Joe Burrow stepping into the NFL. This wasn't Dak Prescott in his rookie year, where you see these guys that are like just way ahead of the curve in terms of rookies. But I don't think he's behind the curve in any way. Like I said, there was a lot of good stuff in there. There were rookie mistakes, especially week 1 coming into the league. He had to learn, you can't really test these elite NFL free safeties like Jesse Bates in the way that you could in the SEC, where guys are playing 25 yards deep over the middle of the field. He had to learn some stuff, just as all rookies have to learn. And there were some bad decisions, but that certainly was not the concern of Bryce Young's season. He threw 10 picks, overall was 23rd in the NFL in turnover-worthy play percentage. Granted, a lot of those were fumbles. And I think as the year went on, and certainly as the year went on, you saw, for the first 3 months of the season, his turnover-worthy play percentage was 3.7%. The last 5 weeks, got it down to 2.2%. You saw him starting to, make less bad decisions with the football, take better care of the ball. You saw that growth. And that was a big thing for him at Alabama, was he just didn't put the ball in harm's way a whole lot. And even in this disastrous situation, he was able to protect the football and not make a ton of bad reads. And another thing with his processing that I liked was he continued to make those tough trust throws. As the year went on, there weren't guys getting open down the field, but in a big 3rd and 9, you would still see him give his guy a chance and do something with the football, whereas a lot of young quarterbacks, they're not going to throw that contested ball and kind of risk the interception. They'll kind of drop their head and look at the rush. Bryce still continued to give his guys chances, and he was actually rewarded for that in some of these games. It just wasn't every week, right? So for me, with all the concerns about Bryce Young, and we're going to get to those, reading defenses, making the right decisions, not really a concern for me. Is there room for growth? Yes, absolutely. But this isn't some stares down first reads, can't throw with anticipation or can't get through progressions and, is constantly throwing the ball to the defense. Those aren't the issues on Bryce Young, and that's a very good baseline to hopefully continue to build off of. And then the other thing is, you saw the playmaking that we loved at Alabama. It wasn't quite as electric as it was at Alabama. There were some moments where he had to learn, what he can get away with in terms of who he can outrun. But you definitely saw the escapability out of the pocket and that natural arm talent on the move, where he has just remarkable accuracy throwing out of platform and great instincts to see throwing windows down the field that a lot of quarterbacks just don't have. You saw those as well. And again, I'm not trying to oversell what he did. It was a bummer of a rookie season. And if he doesn't get better, he will be a bust. I'm not trying to dance around that. But what I am trying to say is, as we're going to talk about, this was a nightmare situation. There were still the flashes of good in there in Bryce Young. And I see people say, he showed nothing. He looked like a, second string backup garbage man at quarterback. And I'm like, man, I'm not going to say he made the most of a bad situation, but he survived and did some stuff. But that does take me to the kind of bad on his tape. And there's kind of 3 highlights with him that you got to see improvement. And number 1 is very straightforward. He's got to get better pre-snap. While we've bashed Frank Reich and some of the other stuff for inability to pick up blitzes and stunts, the quarterback does need to be a part of that. And this was something that was not a strength for him at Alabama. So when it comes to sliding the line, identifying the blitzers, IDing the mic, all of that stuff, Bryce has to take a step up there. He has to be more of a pre-snap field general. And honestly, people talk about if Stroud came in instead of Bryce, what would it have looked like? That might be the biggest difference. Is Stroud is so much better at that stuff at this point in his career in terms of just commanding the huddle and the play call at the line of scrimmage. Got to see more from that from Bryce. And some of the he checked into a screen at the end of the Titans game. It was 4th and 7. They had a game-winning opportunity. He checks into a screen, and it's that wasn't the right check, Bryce. So it's coaching. You're hoping that improves here. But he's just got to get better at it, man. There's no way around it. He's 22 years old. Most rookies aren't great at it. But it's worth pointing out like that he's partially responsible for some of the protection issues that they faced last year. And that also comes with the post-snap against the blitz as well. Just understanding where the blitz is coming from. So like knowing when you don't have numbers to pick up the blitz and when you got to get rid of the ball and just attack the blitz better. So much room for growth in that department. That was it was a large cause of his disappointment as a rookie year. But on a bright side, that's a very common issue for young quarterbacks that generally gets better. So it just has to improve, but I don't think you're necessarily worried about it yet. Now, what you might be a little bit more worried about are these next two issues. So the next thing I want to talk about is really like the combination of his footwork, play style, and size that I think I dismissed a little bit in terms of how big of an issue those were going to be out the gate. So Bryce Young has a very unique drop style. Because he's 5'9.5" or 5'10", whatever he is, he kind of drops a little bit further back, gets more depth in his drops, and kind of tippy toes a little bit just so he can see. And there's benefits to that. I talked about how he does attack the middle of the field better than some of the other short quarterbacks in the league. I think his play style does help his processing, does help his decision making, helps him throw with anticipation. So there's benefits to what he does, but it really hurts him in a couple ways. And number one is when he's getting those deep drops, it really hurts the tackles. It hurts their typical technique and the landmarks they need to hit, and just creates these tough angles where these edges really just have to keep rushing upfield because they're moving forward and the tackles are moving backwards. Eventually, the tackle just can't get that depth, no matter how talented a guy is. So it hurts you in that regard. You saw a lot of Bryce either getting flustered or hit deep into his drops. And then the other thing is because he has this kind of forward-facing tippy-tappy, tiptoe-tappy drop style, a lot of times he's not angling his hips towards his target. He's not stepping into his throws. He's not stepping up into the pocket and then into his throws. And we saw actually a lot of accuracy issues show up in Bryce Young's game that really weren't there at Alabama. And I think it was partially tied to him having a weaker arm. He doesn't have a rocket arm. We knew that about him coming out. I think his arm strength is perfectly fine. I think people are a little harsh on his arm strength. But I think what people are seeing a lot of the times is he's throwing off his back foot, he's throwing across his body, and he's not able to generate that torque and the proper technique that you need to see to throw a high velocity tight spiral. So this is something that we've already seen in OTAs that they're working on. There has been a lot of talk about Dave Canales saying he's going to rework Bryce's footwork. They're going to work on this. It's been spotted in OTAs that it's in progress. And the big question here is, can they find the right balance? I don't think you want to completely take away what he does to help him see the middle of the field in terms of kind of getting on the top of his feet a little bit more, dropping maybe a little bit further, but continuing to have that kind of repeatable footwork where he's stepping into throws, he's stepping up in the pocket at the right moment to help those tackles seal the edge and just create more consistency and timing within the offense. That's going to be probably the hardest thing for the Panthers and for Bryce Young to perfect. I think it's doable. There are smarter coaches in the league that can pinpoint the right way to go about this, but it's got to get done, right? And then the third thing is a little bit more subjective, and that is that I felt like in the second half of the season, as Bryce endured this treacherous protection, that again, it was not entirely his fault. For the most part, it was just offensive linemen getting beat. And their guard play, I mean, you watch the film, you can tell, but the PFF grades on their guards are hilariously bad. It's all in the red. And I think another reason they couldn't pick up a stunt is because it was new guys every single week. They had injuries and guys getting benched, and it was like, oh, we'll try you for 2 weeks. Oh, you suck? Let's go to the next practice squad. Or Cade Jensen, Cade Mays and Nash Jensen looking at you guys. So Bryce was under constant fire. And what we saw with Bryce is something we see with tons of quarterbacks that endure the same thing, in that you had a quarterback that even early in his rookie season, he had that natural it factor in terms of pocket presence, that Joe Burrow, Aaron Rodgers-esque eye in the back of his head, that feel in the pocket to buy space, to not bail out of clean pockets, to trust his protection, to manipulate the pocket and mitigate pressure and still find those late throwing windows, whether that's inside or outside the pocket. You know what I'm talking about? Bryce had that coming out. That was my favorite thing about him. We saw some of that early. Unfortunately, as the year went on, that was much more in flashes, and you did start to see Bryce start to bail out of clean pockets that he wasn't doing earlier in the year, and you started to see him kind of drop his head and look at the rush, and that's a huge concern. There was enough still flashes of great pocket presence in those final 5 or 6 games for me to at least have hope that they didn't break him already in terms of that composure to face the rush. But God, it feels like he's 4 or 5 weeks of like if they hit the ground and the offensive line is bad again, and if he can't get back to that, elite pocket presence that he had coming out of Alabama, that's a really important trait for me, especially when you talk about differentiating average quarterbacks from potentially elite ones. And if he's lost that, I don't want to say he's fucked, but then he's just Daniel Jones. Then he's just Alex Smith, and maybe he can still be a capable starter. But if he's lost that real, like legitimate Mahomesian, Aaron Rodgersian pocket feel and play extension, if he can't get that back, it's going to be really disappointing. I'm not saying it's gone, but you saw the flashes of that confidence to do what he did well start to disappear. So those are the things to look for. Those are the major concerns I saw with him. And then maybe like if I want 3.5 concerns, there was also signs down the stretch where he just stopped looking deep. He made some big throws, but a lot of them were intermediate, 20 to 25 yards. Earlier in the year, he would at least try DJ Chark on a go ball, try, Jonathan Mingo on a deep cross. Second half of the year, you just didn't see a whole lot of those. Everything kind of collapsed in terms of his field of vision, and there were still the occasional deep throws that makes me think, okay, it's not all gone. But he was a great deep ball thrower at Alabama. He was an aggressive deep ball thrower, and that guy just wasn't there anymore in the second half of the year. So it really is an experiment on how quickly can you break a young quarterback, and can he get the deep ball aggressiveness and the pocket feel back here in year 2. Just things to look for, man. And then, look, you have the ugly, which I mentioned, and I've hit on a lot of this stuff already, and I know a lot of people just don't want to hear the excuses, especially the big CJ Stroud fans out there. They want a victory lap. They want to dunk on Bryce Young. And you want to do that, that's fine, but look, man, I watched every game from last year for every team. There was not a team with a worse, harder surrounding cast that was seemingly conspiring against the success of the quarterback than the Carolina Panthers last year. It was an uphill battle from start to finish. Whether it was the coaching, the play calling, it was a nightmare. Lack of creativity, no run game. The run game got a little bit better in the last 8 weeks of the season when Bryce started to play better as well. But I mean, the short yardage failures that they had, they couldn't convert a 3rd and 1, a 4th and 1. They get down in the red zone and just couldn't run the ball when it mattered all year long. We've talked about the O-line issues. I think this was the worst offensive line in the league. Their guard play was hilariously bad. The wide receivers were certainly not great. I think that was probably the lowest on the pecking order of issues, but it was still not a good wide receiver group, right? I think the lack of separation was obvious. I think a lot of that was tied to the play calling. For what it's worth, these receivers actually made plays for Bryce Young when they got good looks. They were towards the top quadrant of the league in terms of just drops and contested catch win rate. So if you want one positive thing that this offense did, it was, they did make some tough catches for Bryce in some tough spots. Not that there weren't frustrating drops in bad situations either, but those are more like they happen for every team. So I think that's less of a knock against the surrounding cast, but separation, certainly. And then, this is where you really get into like crazy excuse territory, but the amount of just inexplicable, inordinately bad breaks that the Panthers had, whether it was like, good fourth down attempts that got spotted like just short of the line to gain that on the original looked like they maybe got the first down. That happened like 2 or 3 times for the Panthers that killed drives. You would see Bryce finally have like a good drive and Miles Sanders would fumble the ball away. Or they'd finally make a play, it'd get called back for a holding. Bryce would finally start to play well, and then he would have to play in a monsoon. The Packers game where Bryce looked like he was maybe having a bit of a coming out party, leads this wonderful 20-second drive to get him into field goal range. They try to get the spike off, and it's like literally less than a tenth of a second away from them getting the spike off in time. Just raw, unadulterated, unparalleled bad luck that happened for the Panthers last year. And look, man, anybody that watched every game, you could feel it. This team just couldn't catch a break as the year went on. And I think Panthers fans will at least appreciate the fact that I saw it, Panthers fans. I felt that being a real thing working against this team last year that just didn't happen to every team. So we don't need to spend any more time on it, but it just was not a practical situation for a rookie quarterback to step in and play. So looking forward, I still do believe in Bryce Young. I have them ranked 25th at quarterback, which is lower than they had them last year. So I'm acknowledging he was not as good as I thought he was coming in, but I still saw the good. And when they gave him a chance, the good came through. And I'm going to bet on that being somewhat there. 25th is not like, oh my God, Bryce Young's going to take the league by storm, right? We talked about his issues. There's a lot of improvement to happen here. But this dude was a monster at Alabama. He was the number 1 pick in the draft for a reason, ahead of a bunch of really good quarterbacks. The majority of people agreed that he should be drafted ahead of CJ Stroud. I was obviously one of those people. And we were all wrong, right? If the Panthers could take a redo, you're taking Stroud. There's no way around it. But that doesn't just mean Bryce Young's a bust either, right? So I'm a believer. Very excited to see where this goes. I will hit on the backup room, even though it's pretty irrelevant. Andy Dalton's a very good backup, one of the best in the league. I guess I'll use this time to talk about, like, a lot of people use Andy Dalton's one start against Bryce Young because Andy got the one start in Seattle and played pretty well. He played very well, actually. Number one, Andy just played out of his mind in that game. He actually looked really good. Number two is that was a really bad Seahawks defense that ran the Fangio disciple BS that has been getting flushed out of the league, the off-zone squishy defense stuff that Bryce Young had similar success later in the year against the Green Bay Packers. You know what I'm saying? So, like, yeah, Andy Dalton showed he's a good backup. He can play out of his mind, get you, put you in a situation to win a football game. But I think people use that start against Bryce Young, and it's like there's some context that matters there. But yeah, he's a good backup, good mentor for Bryce Young. He's known around the league as one of the good guys. So good guy to have in the building for sure. Again, I rank him 25th, and I think the arrow's pointing up. But there's a world where this just isn't it, right? So it's a big year. It's a big year for Bryce and the QB room here. But let's transition to the weaponry here that, yes, I praised them for their lack of drops and ability to win tough catches last year. That was about where the praise stops on this group. The lack of separation, the lack of explosiveness was very, very poor. And when you do search for those sort of separation metrics, the Panthers wide receivers were towards the bottom in the league. And that's where you look at bringing in Deontay Johnson, who has his issues when it comes to drops and contested catches that, again, weren't the issue for the Panthers last year. He's got issues there. But in terms of getting open, I do believe Deontay Johnson is one of the 10 best just raw separators, especially at least in the short to intermediate game that we have in the NFL. And the fact that Pittsburgh parted with this dude for Dante Jackson is pretty crazy to me. He's expensive. He costs about $19-20 million, but I think he's worth every penny. I really do. I think he's a 1B type of wide receiver that's going to be a difference maker for this team. Not to beat a dead horse here, but when you're talking about needing to give a young quarterback a place to go with the football, whether that's against the blitz, against tight man coverage, in a critical 3rd and 4 situation where you need 5 or 6 yards and you need a guy to get open and give you a good look, Deontay might have a couple frustrating drops randomly scattered throughout the year, but outside of that, he has got to be the best possible answer that the Panthers could have found for those types of situations. And for Bryce to know that he has that guy inside the structure of this offense, I think is a critical aspect of his development. So I love that move. I love bringing him in. He's a massive upgrade to what they had last year. And then you have Adam Thielen, who goes from having to be your true do-it-all number 1 wide receiver last year, who had to play inside and out. He now goes to his kind of natural role within any offense, and that is, again, as a short to intermediate, primarily slot weapon, where, honestly, Adam Thielen really impressed me last year. He maybe wasn't healthy in the final year in Minnesota, but he looked faster to me in Carolina. His foot speed, his route running, obviously the tough catches, still that smart guy that can find holes in zones, pace his routes to be QB friendly, work back to the football. There's a lot of good stuff that he did for this Panthers offense last year. Now, he has his deficiencies in terms of stacking players deep and being a mismatch problem and all that stuff, but that's now why you have Deontay Johnson and Xavier Legette, who we're going to talk about. I think with what you saw from Thielen last year, getting into this role with better players around him, it just makes so much more sense and should be so much more structurally sound for this offense. And I do expect him to continue to be a productive guy, and he's another guy that Bryce can trust. If Deontay's the first read and for some reason he's covered up, Thielen can be the trust guy that Bryce can look for and either, work with and scramble drill, wait for him to get open against zone, throw the back shoulder, make the tough catch. That will be Adam Thielen. So converting these 3rd and 4s, 3rd and 5s, which hopefully a better run game will put them in more of those situations, should just help keep the ball rolling with this offense. And then you bring in Xavier Legette, which if I told you that those were your 2 skill sets with your 1 and 2 wide receivers, what else do you want, right? You want a deep threat. You want a field stretcher, a guy to run goes, posts, win tough catches down the field. While we praise this team for, contested catches and a lack of drops, those didn't really come on deep targets. It was more in the short to intermediate, coming down with some tight window throws. And they were hoping Jonathan Mingo could be that player for them. Maybe Terrace Marshall. They were hoping those guys could take a step up. Or fill in Jonathan Mingo's case, and it just wasn't there. They get another very good swing at the bat here in Xavier Legette, who I think is a better prospect than both Marshall and Mingo were. He's not a guarantee to be a hit. He's kind of a 1-year late career breakout, but if you follow his career, you can kind of understand a little bit more of why he was a little bit late to the plate at South Carolina. But man, in terms of the role and what they needed here, he really fits, man. And I talked about Bryce as the year went on, kind of stopped looking down the field because he wasn't trusting these guys. Bringing in an exciting player like Xavier Legette is the best thing they could do to hopefully get the field to open up for Bryce Young. Felt like he had the weight of the world on him, where he had to operate within 10 to 15 yards of the line of scrimmage every single drop back. Having a threat like Legette over the top and someone you can trust to give a deep target once or twice a game, even if it's a schemed up look where you're like, Bryce, we're throwing this. If the safety rotates one way, you're throwing it. That's all stuff that can boost Bryce's confidence and just be critical aspects of his development. So I really love the specific pieces that they brought in, and I think the players themselves are good gambles to make. And you feel like you're putting this in a situation where you're going to get a real answer on Bryce Young, at least with the weaponry here. And then all of a sudden, some of those guys that had to be players for you last year, guys like Mingo and Amir Smith-Marset, you don't want those guys starting, but as depth pieces. And, Mingo is someone that I do think as the year went on, flashed some stuff. Sure, as a wide receiver 4 with some talent that has to work for an opportunity and try to, make it tough on Xavier Legette to be the true number 3. Sure, I'm cool with that now as a wide receiver 4. Amir Smith-Marset as a gadget player that they found some fun stuff to do with late last season. Really creative guy with the ball in his hands. Yeah, I like that as your 5. David Moore is an excellent 6th wide receiver to have. Stepped up for Tampa Bay last year. He's a vertical threat. If Legette is a little bit behind the 8 ball coming into the league, David Moore can provide a little bit of a floor there. And then you're putting Terrace Marshall in a kind of make or break situation where it's like, dude, time to wake up or you're not going to make this football team. Your roster spot's no longer guaranteed. Can that light a fire under his ass? He's a talented former 2nd round pick. Not trying to say he'll work out, but I think competition breeds excellence down there. You got Jalen Coker, who's one of the better undrafted free agent pickups that we saw for wide receivers. A small school kid out of Holy Cross, but honestly, I wrote down on him like, kind of reminds me of Adam Thielen coming out, where he's not the best athlete, but the dude has insane hands and catches everything. I wouldn't be stunned if he beats out Terrace Marshall and they keep 7 wide receivers. You even have a Cam Sims, who's another big-bodied guy who's made some plays in the league. So it's a much, much better wide receiver room. Now, I still rank them as a C-plus grade from 25th to 28th. There's a lot of good groups of weapons in the league. But there are questions here. Xavier Legette, I love the role. I love the potential, but far from proven as a wide receiver 3. And then as you look at sort of the tight end room, that's going to drag it down. If they had an adequate possession tight end, maybe a Hunter Henry or something, this is probably more of a B- skill group, but they are missing some of those sort of ancillary playmakers. Tommy Tremble, I do think, is the week 1 starter for them. He came on late last season, former 3rd round pick, is an athlete, good with the ball in his hands, probably a better blocker in year 1 than Jatavion Sanders. But I think they're going to want to mix in Jatavion Sanders and see what he can do. Myself and many people thought Sanders was going to be a 2nd or 3rd round pick, maybe by this Panthers team. So the fact that they got him in the 4th is really exciting. He's undersized. He's not a great blocker, but he has remarkable hands. His feel for being a receiver is really impressive to me. I think he's very quarterback friendly in terms of winning tough catches, not dropping the football. I feel like he was underrated in terms of working back to the quarterback and sitting down in zones. He gets it in that phase. So he'll be in the mix. And I think by season's end, he'll be someone that's starting and helping move the chains for this group, but it might be a little bit more of a slow burn there. And then you've got Ian Thomas still hanging around because of that awful contract they gave him, but he's a tight end too. And then Steven Sullivan, I'll admit, actually made some tough catches. He was a guy that contributed to some of those good contested catch metrics for this team last year, and Bryce actually started to trust him as the year went on. So I don't know if he'll make the team again, but he actually did some fun stuff last year. I think he'll be in the mix as well, and kind of keep Jatavion Sanders off the field. I don't think Sanders does a whole lot from a fantasy football lens. I think he's more of a year 2 and beyond type of guy, but he does have some really exciting upside to maybe be, I would say something in the Evan Ingram caliber of tight end, where he's a really good receiving threat. He's not as fast as Ingram, but is in terms of he's a guy that I could see being somewhere between the 10th to 14th best tight end in the league someday. I could see it. I thought he was a really good prospect. But again, in terms of this year, probably not getting a whole lot from the tight end room. And then really from the running back room as well. Chuba Hubbard's a solid receiving back, made some good plays last year. Miles Sanders even is a solid receiving back. Raheem Blackshear's solid. Jonathan Brooks showed some good promise as a prospect. These guys will do their job in terms of catching dump offs and the screen game and all that. But it's not like you have some dynamic route runner that is going to blow you away with this group of running backs. The one guy to keep an eye on here is Jaden Sheridan, who was an electric back at, I think, Monmouth University. I'd be curious if he makes the team, how quickly he might be able to climb. the depth chart. But yeah, it's a much better group than it was last year. The fact that they made these great additions and they're still ranking 25th to 28th for me goes to show you like just how far they have to go still and how much they have to prove. But for context, like they ranked 30th coming into the league last year in this series for me, and they underperformed. So kind of shows you where they're coming from there. But let's talk about the run game a little bit. The running back room, I think, is one of those groups that is going to get the job done. They're not necessarily going to help this team, but they're not going to hurt this team either, which is an upgrade from what it was last year. They started Miles Sanders for the first 11 to 12 games of the year, and it was a nightmare. He was horrible. He fumbled the ball. He couldn't hit a hole. Obviously, the run blocking wasn't great either, but they're looking for the first route out of that contract. He might even have a post-June 1st cut type of deal. So if you're watching this 5 days from when I post it, Miles Sanders might not even be here anymore. But Chuba was really good. He's that kind of speed train runner. I do think, he's best in a wide zone type of offense because I don't think he's got the best patience or the best vision in between the tackles. But on wide zone runs, he does have really good, ability to kind of press the hole, but also to see those cutbacks. And that's going to be their focus this year. Again, they kind of made that pivot mid-season last year with Thomas Brown taking over to do a little bit more wide zone, and it's not a coincidence that Chuba kind of broke out in the second half of the year. So he's on the last year of his deal. I think paying a running back is the last thing that the Panthers are worried about right now, and that's why they drafted Jonathan Brooks in the second round. So I do think this is Chuba's backfield now. But I think with that high draft capital investment, making Jonathan Brooks the first running back off the board, someone that they, on paper, traded Brian Burns for, right? They're going to want to make him the guy when they invest that much in him. But with Brooks coming off of the ACL injury, I don't think they're going to be rushed here, right? And again, we'll see what they do with Miles Sanders, if they even keep him. But I could see Chuba being a bit of a fantasy sleeper. I don't necessarily know where he's going right now. It's a little early in the process, but if you're talking about your underdog best ball drafts, or your redrafts or whatever, I believe in Chuba Hubbard. I think he's really talented. I think he is working for a contract this year. But again, I don't think that contract is going to come from the Panthers because Jonathan Brooks is really good. And even though Trey Benson was my number one running back and he would have been my pick, Brooks is still really talented in his own right. I compare him to Melvin Gordon. I see a lot of similarities there, minus the fumbling issues, which is a huge note there. But, north and south runner who at the point of attack has really light feet, that'll play in the NFL. He's got plenty of athleticism. We obviously didn't get testing numbers because coming off that ACL, but would have tested very well. He's got breakaway speed. I mentioned the agility. But he can run between the tackles. I think he can thrive in outside zone. He can thrive in gap, inside zone, whatever you want to do with him. He has full scheme flexibility in a way that Chuba probably doesn't, because I think Brooks's vision is a little bit better between the tackles. And I think his creativity out in the open space is better as well. So I'm not going to predict a monster rookie season from Jonathan Brooks because I think Chuba will have a good year. But year two for Brooks, if this offense continues to build towards the right direction, does, I think, have, dare I say, superstar potential. I really do believe that. But until you get that superstar, it's just a good, useful running back room. And then, honestly, the depth's adequate. Miles Sanders, I would even go as far as saying him as an RB3 is just a very average RB3. Like, I really think he's that bad. And I was hard on the Panthers in this series talking about him last year. I was like, I just don't see it. I even said, fantasy football, give me Chuba Hubbard over him. In time, that played out. But you got Raheem Blackshear, who's more of a scat back type. Rashad Penny, I'd be a little surprised if he made the team just with his injury issues. And I mentioned Jaden Sheridan is a fascinating player. I could see in time Sheridan being a really nice scat back, change of pace type of dude for Jonathan Brooks. Really electric tape and tested really well and produced like crazy, just really small level of competition. So we'll start by seeing if he makes the team, and then we'll go from there. But maybe someone to put on your watch list in your dynasty leagues. And then in terms of the multiplier they get from the quarterback, it's nothing significant. It's in a large cluster of teams that get just like a very marginal boost from the mobility aspect of the quarterback. I think they could use Bryce more on read options and stuff. Just mixing it in to keep teams honest, I think would be smart. And he's good about sliding and not taking hits when he does that kind of stuff. So like that can just help keep that backside end from blowing plays up. And they just didn't do that last year. Not that they have a huge record of doing that stuff with Dave Canales, but also Baker Mayfield was his quarterback, so you're not going to do a ton of that stuff. It's something to keep an eye out for, but I also think just like he's going to be a really dangerous threat off of play action boots. I anticipate this to be a very wide zone, play action boot naked style offense. And with some of the throws Bryce had on the move and some of the flashes off of play action boots that they had late last season, that as well should really keep defenses honest to have to protect against that boot, because he can explode off of that play fake and get out into space in a hurry, and is really dangerous. So I do think there's a little bit of a presence with Bryce that they could tap into a little more than the regime did last year. But it's pretty minor in terms of how it's helping out the run game. But let's talk about the offensive line. And look, I was very optimistic about this O-line last year being a strength for this team, and that obviously backfired. I still look at this team on paper, and they obviously improved it with some of these signings. And I actually think there's no reason that this shouldn't be a top half of the league offensive line in the league. I have them ranked 12th to 17th, and I'm kind of doubling down on this being a good group. And I think the removal of Frank Reich, I think hopefully some improvements from Bryce Young in terms of pre-snap adjustments and stuff. And then, of course, we talked about the additions that this O-line made. There's no reason that this shouldn't be a good offensive line this year. And honestly, it's hard to say after what happened last year, but it really should be a group that you're excited about. This on paper could be a top 10 to great offensive line, but they've got to put everything together. But a big thing that has to come through is Ike Ekwonu. A lot of Panthers fans I've talked to have just given up on Ike after it was a bad second year. I don't think it was quite as bad as a lot of Panthers fans made it out to be. It actually reminded me a little bit of what Bears and Commanders fans have gone through with Charles Leno, where he has some just really frustrating, ugly losses where he's just kind of like doing stupid shit, whether it's letting guys cross his face in the run game or not picking up a blitz, or his ability to handle all of the stunts and stuff was really frustrating last year. And then he just had some really clunky, ugly losses that Charles Leno would have. That's why it kind of reminded me of that, where all of a sudden his technique just looks gross and he's getting beat around the corner. I'll admit, he had some frustrating losses in big moments, and I get why Panthers fans are frustrated with Icky. But in terms of pass protection, I still think there's a good left tackle in there. As a rookie, again, I thought he really surprised in that department. And honestly, the conglomerate of his season, at least one-on-one blocking dudes up, wasn't all that bad. Now, it wasn't great, as we mentioned, but there's plenty of reason to believe that a former top, the sixth pick in the draft, that in year 3 with better coaching and a system that will hopefully get him to play faster and play better, there's plenty of reason to believe that the arrow can be pointing up on him and not to give up on him quite yet. But there's also reasons to be questionable about, honestly, man, as a run blocker, what the fuck happened to Icky? That was his thing at NC State. He was a world beater, like coming off the ball. And granted, a lot of it was wide zone stuff, and I think with better coaching, you could get that guy back. But dude, he would fly off the ball. He would delete dudes. He would climb to the second level with confidence, find the right guy, bury him. That guy was gone last year. He was slow off the ball, constantly missing assignments. Like, just didn't look like he knew what he was supposed to do. And I think coaching is obviously a huge part of that. A lot of the guys on this offensive line didn't know what they were supposed to do. And that showed up in terms of blitz pickup and stunt pickup. There's so much just confidence and mental stuff that is missing with Icky right now that I understand the frustrations. But they just got to find that dog back because, he just wasn't there last year. So that's there's reason to believe in Icky, but there's reasons to believe this could continue to be a problem. It could go in a lot of different directions, right? He's kind of the big pivot wild card for this O-line, whereas the rest of this group, man, like, there's no way this isn't a good group. There's too many guys, and they're all proven pieces. Damian Lewis is proven at this point. He's a good player. If he's your fourth best offensive lineman or even your third best offensive lineman, you're totally fine with that. Got a very fair contract for how he's played. He's got a great anchor. He's got ridiculous strength in his arms and his core. He's tough. I think he's done a brilliant job to improve his feet and his technique, where he will still lose when he stops his feet at times. That's why he's not an elite pass protector, but it's certainly improved to the point where he's able to get in front of guys a lot better. So good player, man, and a good run blocker. Very reason to believe that he's going to be a problem for this offensive line. Maybe not the most overly consistent or dominant player, but a very good guard and a good signing for this team. Austin Corbett sliding into center makes total sense for me. A veteran, smart, tough dude that missed basically all of last year after a very good year for the Panthers in 2022. He was one of the more sound guards in football. And I just think he can move into center. He's got all the like size and tools and measurables that should check out there. He just has to learn how to snap. That's probably the second biggest question for this offensive line is, does the snapping element throw him off? But I just think he can handle it. He was a lowly drafted guy that had to earn his stay in the NFL, and adding a snapping component to that doesn't feel like that big of a hurdle for him to figure out. I think in terms of managing protections and calling out stuff, like, I think he's plenty experienced enough to handle that aspect of it. So that makes sense to me. I think he can be a very solid center. And then Robert Hunt at right guard, they gave him a massive contract. I mean, did they have to overpay to get him here a little bit? Yeah, sure. But you look at the guard market, you look at what guys like Landon Dickerson got, like, right in this ballpark of over $20 million. Like, Robert Hunt is every bit as good as Landon Dickerson. I mean, what's literally not to like about Robert Hunt, other than he's not like a phenomenal athlete, but as he's shown in Miami, he is a good enough athlete to block wide zone and get on the move and be a puller on trap. Like, absolutely. I had questions about that with Mike McDaniel coming in, but Robert Hunt has proven himself in that phase. He's got an incredible anchor. He's smart in terms of picking up stunts and blitzes, which was obviously a frustration of this team. Just identifying those loopers coming through the A gap or the B gap. Robert Hunt's going to be so much better at that. So love that signing. He's a total stud. And then Taylor Moton, he was actually good last year, despite the nightmare that was the Panthers offense. So there's no reason to believe he won't continue to be the stud top 5 to 10 right tackle that he's been really his whole career. If there's anything in this offense that deserves to not be questioned, it's Taylor Moton. So that's just the starters. And I actually think their depth is some of the best in the league. Josh Nijman is a borderline starting caliber tackle. He is not a good run blocker, which has held him back at times in terms of winning the favor of the coaching staff. And he's got slower feet. His technique is just average. So, like, he will have losses, but he has started, 20 games for the Packers over the last 2 years, and more often than not is not a problem. So as a backup tackle, that's great. And then you get Brady Christensen, who, look, like, Brady was supposed to be the weak link of their offensive line last year as a starter. And in a best case scenario, I think that was reasonable to be like, yeah, he could be a starter if he's your fifth worst player. If we're using a baseball reference, if he's the fifth guy in your rotation, you can live with it. Like, he now takes a backup role as a guy with interior flexibility. He's another guy that I think always kind of had center potential, just with, he's a really good wide zone blocker, at least in terms of his ability to reach block. He entered as a tackle. He moved into guard. Could he be a backup center as well? I think so. They'd have to work on his ability to snap, but again, is someone that I was like somewhat okay with him as a starter last year before he got hurt in like week 1 for the year, to be your backup on the inside. You're running 7 deep of guys that you can put out there and think is better than what you had last year, basically. And then Cade Mays had to play last year. He actually was a piece that helped their run game. That was never really a question with him. He's an abysmal pass protector. You don't really want him. But if he's got to get in there for a game because Lewis gets hurt or Hunt misses a game or whatever, and you got a guy you can get behind and try to help with double teams and pass pro and stuff, if it's just one issue out there as opposed to 3 or 4, you can kind of shelter that with your coaching a little bit better. And then Chandler Zavala was a 4th-round pick last year that was brutally terrible when he played, but still has potential as a 8th guy to make this offensive line, as opposed to someone that had to start last year. That's not too bad. So, look, I really like this offensive line. Maybe I'm doubling down on what happened last year with, on paper, what looked like a good line, but this is where I'm most confident with this offense, honestly, is that this is going to be a dramatically improved group. I honestly believe that they're going to go from the 32nd offensive line last year to the 14th best O-line. And that will do wonders for everybody involved. How could it not? So I know we're ranking this team 30th in the power rankings. There's other reasons for that, but this is really what you can hopefully hang your hat on here. It's an exciting group, man. I really think it is. But with that said, the offense is still going to enter the season ranked towards the bottom. 29th in passing game, 29th in run game, good for 30th overall. They just have a lot to prove, right, man? Like, a lot of changes, a lot of new faces, new coaching staff. Bryce has to prove what he can do. The receivers have to prove what they can do. In this series, we're really ranking these teams at their floor, and until the Panthers can prove that everything that they did this offseason was the right move on the football field, they just can't rank that high with how we do things in this series. But love the upside. Love everything they've done. Everything makes sense to me. And if this ends up the 17th offense in the league this year and they're really looking like this is the right kind of plan, wouldn't be surprised. So very excited to see where things go on that side of the ball. And then defensively, I'm not going to say I'm not excited for this defense, but a little bit more vanilla-ish, I suppose, just in terms of what the expectations are. I think, the range of outcomes I feel like isn't quite as broad for this Panthers defense. There's definitely some new faces and fun players to talk about here, but their focus is offense this year, right? They kind of went in knowing that they're going to have some holes on this defense, and they're just going to try to have Evero lift this group up. But let's get into it. So starting on the defensive line, they're kind of a below average D-line to me. Not that it's a horrible group, but they get that C+ overall grade from me. A C in terms of pass rush and a B+ towards the top of the league, actually, in terms of D-line run defense. That is actually a fun starting point if you want a point of positivity for this defense. Is not only is the O-line dramatically improved, but I do think in terms of run defense, this D-line is one of the most improved units in the league, because last year it was really just Derek Brown and nothing else. Brian Burns is not known for his run defense. They had Shy Tuttle, was a total flop for them, a moving collection of pieces on the opposite edge. Whereas now you still have Derek Brown to be a complete alpha, nose tackle, 3-tech, wherever they want to put him. He is a huge problem in terms of run defense, just got a big contract extension. But they bring in Ashawn Robinson from the Giants, who's still a very solid, sound run defender with a lot of size. And then Jadeveon Clowney is one of the better run defending edge players and has been over the course of his career. And at least in terms of run defense, is actually an upgrade from Brian Burns last year. And now Shy Tuttle becomes a rotational piece, and Nick Thurman is a guy that popped for me on film in the second half of the year as a nice rotational interior piece. So there actually aren't really any weak links with this run defense. Even DJ Wanham, who should be starting opposite of Jadeveon Clowney, was a very solid run defender for the Vikings last year. So if you want one area that this defense should actually be dramatically improved, I do think it's run defense, starting with the D-line, and then some of the stuff we'll talk about with the linebackers as well. This team was actually towards the bottom in terms of run defense last season, but I do think a lot of that was personnel, a lot of it was injuries, and a lot of it was just the fact that this defense was on the field all day long, oftentimes playing when the game was well out of hand. So I do think the run defense will be a significant improvement for this team. But in terms of the pass rush, this should be a worse unit than it was last year, and this wasn't even that great of a pass rush last year, but you did lose your number one edge rusher, your number one pass rusher in Brian Burns, and trying to replace him with a collection of other players, and that's just easier said than done. You don't have that difference maker. It just is a drop-off. There's no way around it. Now, that doesn't mean Jadeveon Clowney wasn't a good signing. He was about as good of a rebound as they could make after trading Brian Burns, I think. And, you know, if he can be anything close to what he was last year, that's great. I'm actually not projecting that to be the case because, you know, we give him an 80 grade as a pass rusher here. He played like a mid-80s. He played like a stud, maybe even like a low-end number one like Brian Burns was last year. He was awesome for the Ravens. Do you expect him to be exactly that good in what was honestly like basically a career year? He hadn't been that good since his first couple of years before the injuries started to rack up, and I think he lost a little bit of that twitchy freakiness that he once had. You know, still a great athlete, but maybe not the elite number one overall pick generational athlete that he was coming out of South Carolina. But he definitely earned this contract, had a huge year for the Ravens last year. And it wasn't just Mike McDonald's system that kind of schemed him up a bunch of easy, looping unblocked sacks either. He actually had a very good pass rush win rate. Now, I do think the blitz looks and how they crafted their front did a very good job of making sure Clowney didn't see a ton of double teams and got legit one-on-one opportunities, and that the quarterback had nowhere to go but into Jadeveon Clowney, but he was also beating his guy. So, I think he's coming from a very lucrative situation, both statistically and financially, coming from Baltimore. But I think he learned a little bit about himself and developed some ways that he can win as a rusher, more than we had really seen in Tennessee and Cleveland and Seattle over the last few years, where he was more of just a ball of energy trying to win with physical tools. I really did see a ramp up in the pass rush mentality from Jadeveon Clowney that should translate to him still being a very capable number 2 rusher here. So I like the signing, but he's not Brian Burns. And then, if Clowney's a number 2, is Derek Brown a number 1? As a rusher, no. I mean, I think Derek Brown is one of the best overall defensive tackles in the NFL. I think he's entirely underrated. I probably undersold him as a run defender with how we're structuring this conversation. He never comes off the field. He's a space eater. He sheds blocks. He keeps his eye in the backfield. He's an incredible run defender. Genuinely one of the most underrated players in the league for that regard. Now, a reason he's probably quote-unquote underrated is because he's not some dominant pass rusher. He's a very good pass rusher. He's going to get you that kind of 45, 50 pressure mark as a kind of number 2 guy. His sack production's been very low. I think that's just bad luck. I think there's more sacks coming his way in time. Basically, with Brown, if you leave him one-on-one, he will create push. He's got ways to get off blocks and get after the quarterback. He is a disruptive, power rushing defensive tackle. He has adequate kind of quickness and finesse, but he doesn't consistently dominate with that. And he's also a guy that is consistently double teamed because of his size, because of the power element. He's not a guy you can really leave one-on-one. And it's very easy for teams to approach this D-line and be like, all right, we're going to slide towards Derek Brown. If Clowney kills us, so be it. Maybe we can chip Clowney with a tight end or whatever. But the reason this is a C-ranked pass rush is because you game plan for Brown and Clowney's not a guy that's going to kill one-on-ones in the way that Brian Burns was. There's no one else here that's going to beat you. And you can really focus on two guys, and if any of these other guys beat you, so be it. But I mean, on the interior, they got nothing. A'Shawn Robinson's a good signing as a run defender, but has never been a presence as a rusher. Shai Tuttle is like a diminished version of that. Nick Thurman, again, he flashed some stuff as an older defensive tackle, kind of making a way into this rotation, but nothing as a rusher. LeBrian Ray is kind of a early down hybrid end. Hasn't shown anything as a rusher. Jaden Crometti is a project. There's really nothing else coming from the interior, so you can just take the center and the guard, handle Derek Brown, and leave the other guy one-on-one, and it's a very easy game plan to go about that. That's a concern. It's a primary reason this is not a very high-ranking pass rush. And then opposite end, like DJ Wanham's been a number 2 edge rusher that nobody's been worried about for 4 years. He's ultimately ended up with decent sack numbers because he's played 1 million snaps. And if you play 600 snaps a year and the modern passing game and you're getting after the quarterback, inevitably you're going to accidentally get 8 or 9 sacks. You're going to win a rep here or a rep there, but he is a third edge through and through that in Minnesota was asked to be a number 2 edge for a long time, and that was underwhelming, and it's going to be the same case here in Carolina. He'll eat up reps and play hard, but not someone you're afraid of. And then there's a steep drop-off after that. You got Kayvon Chason, who's at this stage kind of an early down flex piece for Avero, who does like to run a lot of that, kind of stand-up edge. He ran a lot of 5-1 last year, kind of like what we broke down with the Patriots. I think that was more about the injuries that they saw and the personnel that he had, but he will run 5-1 and drop these edge guys into coverage. That is where Chason has usefulness, but he's a first-round bust for the Jags. You got DJ Johnson. I mean, I liked DJ Johnson as like a 5th-round flyer last year on an older, freaky athlete with a good power rush at times, but they took him in the 3rd round, and he was just not a starting caliber player. So he'll be in the mix. Amari Barno, he actually showed some flashes to me in the games that I saw. We'll see what they can kind of get from him. Eku Leota. I don't know why that was so hard for me to say, but he was another kind of hybrid outside backer that I liked, praised for his effort and leadership at Auburn. And then Cam Gill, another one of those hybrid types. So, you've got 3 guys in Chason, Gill, and Leota who are hybrid early down edge players, and then some kind of freaky flyers on guys like DJ Johnson and Amari Barno, who are both probably 25 years old at this point, that you're basically getting nothing from them until they prove otherwise. So this is really where you feel the offseason hurting, is the D-line depth in the pass rush. And my goodness, if Clowney gets banged up or Derek Brown gets banged up, this could be one of the worst pass rushes in the league. So they've got an adequate kind of 2-2 punch. I can't say a 1-2 punch because they're a pair of number 2 guys, but pretty easy guys to game plan for, and then no one else is going to hurt you. So that's what drags this group down, is the pass rush, which is more heavily weighted than run defense. But I do think they're going to be forcing more, 3rd and long, stopping the run significantly better than they were last year, which was a huge problem. And you don't want to just dismiss that. The run defense does still matter, even if I have a heavier weight towards pass defense. But let's talk about the linebackers here. It's a good, underrated group, man. Honestly, I think we so often just forget that guys get hurt and then come back. And that's a Shaq Thompson situation where he was someone they were counting on with a lack of depth in this linebacker room last year. They were really counting on him to be the leader of this defense. And he goes down, I think, week 2 with a broken leg. And they were scrambling from that point on. I mentioned that they were basically only using one linebacker the majority of the time, running 5-1 fronts. And, Frankie Louva was that middle linebacker who did a very good job here last year. But they, I believe, are confident in getting Shaq Thompson back. Broken bones, it's more of it just takes time, but it's not like a ligament or a muscle where you're a little more worried about durability after that injury. I think you're pretty confident that Shaq should be able to stay healthy and be a good player. He's older. He's 31 years old. But he's played some of his best football in recent years, specifically as a run defender where, he was kind of a safety coming out of Washington. It took him a while playing next to Luke Kuechly to really understand the position, which is very normal for the linebacker spot, especially for a guy that played a lot of defensive back in college. But I mean, he is full sized at this point. He's got, a great mind for the position. He's useful in coverage. He's a really good player that they badly missed last year. So he's back. And then I love the Josey Jewell signing. If you're going to keep Evero here, and the idea is this scheme and this coaching being the core thing keeping you afloat with this defense, getting in a guy who's an extension of that coaching staff on the field in Josey Jewell, who knows this defense in and out. He entered the league with it in Denver, or at least his second year would have been that. But I've always felt like Josey Jewell is underrated because he's not the biggest guy. He's not the fastest guy. He was a mid-round draft pick, but all he's done since he entered the league is be a very solid linebacker, honestly, in both phases. He's a good run defender just because he's a step ahead. He shoots gaps. He has a good balance of when to be aggressive, when to let things come to him. Pretty secure tackler. Like, there's very little bad things to say about him in run defense other than just the physical dominance isn't really there. Like, he can get outmatched on a block, or someone will run through a tackle attempt, or his foot speed will get him lost, and he'll miss a tackle or whatever. But in terms of coverage, he's actually really underrated. Likewise, he's not the rangiest guy. He's not going to man a ton of dudes up, but he actually, in my opinion, has some of the best zone IQ in the league, and it compensates for the total lack of physical ability that he has. He's very good at these cover 3 zone match defenses where whether it's play action or just drop back passing game, he does a really good job of keeping things in front of him while also keeping that eye and keeping his head on a swivel, and is aware of those underneath or over the top intermediate threats, whether it's a crossing route or a dig, and he'll cut those things off. You don't see a ton of ball production, but he's in the way enough usually that quarterbacks will stay away from throwing at him. So he's underrated in that sense. So it's a really solid linebacker duo. I've got them ranked kind of like right in the middle of the league in that 15th, 19th range. I think it's a group that is going to, kind of like the running back room here. It's not going to necessarily help them, but it's not going to hurt them. There's a lot of way worse linebacking groups in the league that are legitimate liabilities, and I just don't see that being the case with these two dudes. Now, if Shaq can't stay healthy, then they're in trouble because their depth is hilariously bad. Trevin Wallace was a third-round pick, and I'm not even going to say it was a bad third-round pick, but I'm on the record saying he was one of the worst football players in this draft class currently. Freaky traits, super young, 21 years old, coming out of the SEC, has some splash plays. He is entirely reactive. He has no discipline, no idea of what he's looking at. I list him as the second string because there's really nobody else, and they did spend a third-round pick on him. They might just throw him into the fire if they had to play him, but he's not better than Tay Davis, who's played snaps in the league. He's not better than Michael Barrett, who was a 7th-round pick out of Michigan, who just understands the position better with, couldn't be any opposite in terms of physical tools, where he's undersized and slow. So we'll see if they have to go to their depth, if they would even play Trevin Wallace. And maybe, learning under fire could be good for him. But in the long term, if he has to step in, he will be probably the worst linebacker in the NFL. And it's not even necessarily an indictment on the draft pick or who he is. It's just the nature of the position. And he's a young player that declared early. They got to have patience with him. But it's not like you're excited about Michael Barrett stepping in as a 7th-round rookie. It's kind of a higher floor, lower ceiling type of prospect. Tay Davis, who used to start for those horrible Giants linebacking groups like in 2019, 2020, he's still hanging around. So the depth is horrible. And there's a piece of me that says, please, Lord, let Shaq Thompson come back healthy off that broken leg, because if he can't, this group could have some liabilities in it. But solid group with the 2 starters healthy. Let's talk about the secondary. This group very much is what it is. There's not a ton to say about this secondary other than, after this year, they need to add more pieces. They need to get younger and more explosive. They have 5 players that I think make up an adequate secondary. And one of them is their best player, J.C. Horn, is wildly injury prone. He was coming out of college and has been in the NFL. So he's great when he plays. He looks like a number one, and every time he is able to get 4 or 5 straight games on paper, you're like, great. Like, he's emerging as the top 10 pick that they spent on him. Like, too bad they passed on Pat Surtain. That sucks, but at least J.C. Horn's going to be a number one corner for them. And then he gets hurt again. So it's like, the dude stay healthy? He's heading into year 4. I have no questions about who he is when he plays. He's a super physical, smart dude. Can go man, can go zone. He's got the bloodlines. Dad's Hall of Famer, right? Like, I love J.C. Horn when he plays. And this team should have taken Pat Surtain, like I said, the day of the draft. But if he's healthy, you got a number one. That's a big if. And if you could guarantee me health, I would even put an up arrow on him. But at this point, and he is such a physical player that he's, throwing his body around. At this point, I'm kind of so sure that you're only getting 8 to 12 games out of J.C. Horn that kind of takes this from a C+ secondary down to a C. We'll talk about the problems in terms of depth here in a minute, but they are losing Dante Jackson, who's been an adequate number 2 corner, and replacing him with Dane Jackson. Very similar name, very similar caliber player, very different play style. Dane Jackson is a much more heady, high zone IQ player, not the speed to be a playmaker in a zone heavy system like this. And certainly not a guy that can theoretically man guys up as well as Dante Jackson could, but Dante was never a great man-to-man corner anyway. He was always better in theory because he has the 4.2 speed than he was in terms of total production. I actually think clearing his money off the books, getting Deontay Johnson, and then bringing in Dane Jackson, who has started a lot of games for a very similar style defense in Buffalo, was a brilliant move. So, he will lose. He will get beat. He will get physically outmatched. He won't be able to get to his spots in time. He's just not a shutdown corner by any stretch of the imagination, but he's a sound player for nothing here and a good signing. And then Troy Hill is back. He actually played very well last year. He's a hyper high IQ player, quick feet, 34 years old. So he's an adequate slot corner. Not really too much else to say about him, but I don't mind bringing him back. And if he hasn't fallen off at 33, I don't anticipate he's going to fall off at 34. I think he's going to be okay. And then the safeties, you bring in Jordan Fuller, super sound player that's played this system, someone that Avero's familiar with. He had him with the Rams. So, you're getting probably the smartest player he had in the Denver defense for Avero, Josie Jewell, and probably the smartest player not named Aaron Donald that he had with that Rams defense. So I like the signing. He's a push with Von Bell, another good, solid player, but, he's just not a hyper athlete. This is going to be one of the slower secondaries in the league with Fuller back there, with Hill and Jackson. They're going to try to, be disciplined, be smart, keep things in front of them, and get through the year. I think for what they paid Fuller, though, it was another good budget signing. He probably is worth more than he got paid here. And then Xavier Woods is back. So another year in the system with him. He had a good year last year. He's been a just very good, solid starter. He's never been anything more. Has hardly ever been anything less. So, again, you have 5 capable starters outside of J.C. Horn, and if he could stay healthy, there's no one you're, super stoked about. But I don't think they have a liability player in their starting lineup either. One note is for a lot of teams, we list a kind of 6th defensive back here. I think with their lack of depth and with the defensive Vero wants to run, this is primarily going to be a nickel-based defense with the 2 linebackers on the field and these 5 defensive backs. Now, as we know, injuries happen. And if and when that happens for this Panthers secondary, they're in trouble. To me, the best guy off the bench is their 5th-round rookie in Chow Smith-Wade, who to me has long-term maybe starting potential as a slot. There's some Troy Hill in his game where he's not the fastest guy, but he's smart and likes to tackle and all that stuff. So I don't mind him as a 5th-round pick, but again, that shouldn't be your 4th corner. And then it's this motley crew of whatever. Deshaun Jamison, who had to play some last year, made some plays but got beat a lot as well. DiCaprio Boodle, member of the all-name team. Lamar Jackson, not the quarterback. Willie Drew, an undrafted corner out of Virginia State who tested well but looked horrible to me at the Senior Bowl, looked out of place. So to me, this team needs to add some veteran depth. It doesn't need to be anything special, but someone that's played and started games in the last 2 years, maybe with some flexibility so that they don't have to go to this group of corners. Like, that's one more piece I think they need to add here, even though they've already signed a guy like Dane Jackson. And then the safety depth is a little better. Sam Franklin and Nick Scott have at least played significant time. I think as backups, they're whatever. If they have to start a game or two, you're not going to get devastated. But, Nick Scott was pretty bad for the Bengals, was a little better with those Rams defenses in years before that. And then Sam Franklin, I really don't mind him as a third safety. He's whatever, kind of replacement level depth. And then you got Alex Cook, who got some snaps for this team last year. A pair of undrafted rookies there, Damani Richardson and Clayton Isbell. So, again, the depth is abysmal. They will have injuries at some point, and that's when you could really feel this defense loosening up. And it happened last year, too. So that's not even really anything new for this defense. But like I said, Evero has his work cut out for him. An abysmal pass rush, an abysmal secondary, average linebacking group. There's really not a whole lot of special on this defense outside of the D-line run defense, which I know wasn't great last year, but you look at the bodies that they have this year, and also like the linebacking run defense should be better. You at least have two guys this year. They felt like they had to live in that 5-1 front last year because they had nobody else that could play linebacker. Now you have Jewell and Shaq Thompson, who are just good run defenders overall. So I do think that will be a big upgrade for the defense, is that, they're going to be forcing a lot of 3-and-8s that they weren't necessarily last year. But can they hold up as well on 3-and-8 without Brian Burns out there, without Frankie Louvu as well, who was a really dynamic blitz threat for them? They don't have that dynamic blitzing presence anymore either. Didn't really mention that as much, but yeah, I don't have great expectations for this pass defense, and I don't think the Panthers front office does either, right? Like, it's not a priority for them. They're really hoping Jero Evero can do a lot of the heavy lifting here. So they come in as the 27th ranked defense for me, with the run defense doing a lot of the heavy lifting there. I know that's surprising to see them ranking 6th for run defense, and maybe I'm crazy, but I really do believe that last year's, I think they were 31st in defensive run defense DVOA last year. I think obviously massive part of that was the injuries, the lack of personnel, and just how often they were on the field and how the game scripts went for them. So I do think it'll be better for them this year. But let's talk a little special teams before we kind of tie a ribbon on all of this. So it's very ironic. The special teams rankings have come in exactly in order of when these teams have been revealed. It's a complete coincidence, but we had Washington at 32. Their special teams were 32. New England followed suit, and now the Panthers are 30th. I don't think that trend's going to continue with our next team, but this is where the Panthers came out in my formula, where we take the PFF team grade, the DVOA rankings, their kicker and punter grades, and a little bit of that benefit of the doubt slider that we talked about with the overall coaching culture. And the Panthers have work to do. And I do think with a changing of the guard, with a lack of depth that we saw at linebacker and defensive back, which make up your primary kick cover people, Eddie Pinheiro is nothing special as a kicker. Johnny Hecker at this point in his career is nothing special as a punter. He's ranked 23rd, averaged out over the last 2 years. Yeah, they just don't have an impactful special teams, but you're hoping the new coordinator and some of the new depth pieces, can Chow Smith Wade and Wallace and Michael Barrett be difference-making special teamers. That's the hope. But as we wrap this whole thing up, again, 30th for offense, 27th for defense, good for the 30th overall team in my power rankings. This season's really not about wins and losses. It's about surviving on the defensive side of the ball, where they don't really have a lot of young, exciting players, and it's about those additions you made offensively that just have to prove themselves. It's about those things hitting. Coaching staff, Bryce Young, offensive line, weaponry, running backs, you name it. Everything needs to get better. And if this team can be a 6-7 win team in a bad division and feel good about the state of their offense to the point that they can focus on defensive talent a little bit more next offseason, that's like the best case scenario for this Panthers team. But let's take a look at that schedule and see how realistic that is. Their over-under is 5.5 wins, well above the 2 wins they got last year. But those are the lowest in the league, although some places you look have the Patriots at 4.5 for over-under because their schedule is so bad. For the Panthers, their schedule's actually pretty favorable. They play the NFC East, which has obviously a couple good teams, but Washington and the Giants are winnable games for them. Their own division sucks. They get Chicago and Arizona with that 4th place schedule, and then they play the AFC West, which is the worst of the AFC divisions. So that's a great draw for the Panthers, I would say, in such a critical year for this team's development to, I think, get a pretty favorable schedule. You know, I don't look at this and think they'll be favored in a whole lot of games, at least until they can prove some stuff. But the majority of their games, I think they're 3-point underdogs, you know, with very winnable odds on them. They've obviously got their potential blowouts with teams like Cincy coming to town week 4, Philly week 14, Kansas City. Every team's going to have a few of those, but they don't have a ton of like really hard games other than that. I had Dallas at home, but I like getting them at home as opposed to having to go to Dallas and then at Atlanta week 18 when theoretically this team should be kind of figuring themselves out by then. So it is one of the more favorable schedules that we'll see here. And I think in terms of this team having upside offensively, for me at least, being a Bryce Young believer and a believer in all the other stuff that they did, I actually would bet the over on this. I don't think they smash it. I don't think this is a, wild card sleeper team. I just don't think that's realistic to project that. But I do think this team can get to 6 or 7 wins with this schedule. So this is the first one in this series that I actually would bet the over. I would bet that my 30th ranking of this team ages poorly. Again, these power rankings are what they are week 1. I'm not saying the Panthers will definitely finish 30th. There's more nuance in a 2-hour-long video for you guys to determine how I think a team will finish, right? So I do believe in the Carolina Panthers, but I'm also not going to come out and rank them 24th either because they haven't earned it. So there are your Carolina Panthers and another really fun deep dive. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. If you haven't hit that like button by now, please do. It takes just one more second out of the thousands of seconds you've already invested into this video. It really helps me out. Let me know your comments down below. Who do you think comes next in the series? Do you agree with this ranking of the Panthers? What record do you think they'll finish with this season? Let me know all of it in the comments down below. And we'll see you guys within the week for team number 29. Thank you, and we'll see you later. Peace out.